Welcome back, everybody, to SF Live. My name is Kai Hoffmann. I'm the CEO of the Soar Financial Group. And today we have a very special guest. It's James Turk. He's the founder of GoldMoney, and he's an author as well. He just published a book in late 2021, Money and Liberty, The Pursuit of Happiness, and the Theory of Natural Money. Really looking forward to a discussion with him, because James Turk is somebody I've heard the name of when I started in the industry 12 years ago. I never had a chance to speak with him, although through Josh Crump at GoldMoney, we had a bit of a connection, but we never had a chance to catch up. That's why I'm really looking forward to this. It feels like a bit of I'm talking to one of the stars of my childhood, and really excited to have him on. But before I switch over to my guest, please be reminded to follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, hit that like and subscribe button, of course, and leave a comment. What do you think will happen? Is the Fed going to explode, implode, or whatever? And what is the US dollar doing? Do you think gold and silver are the solution? Maybe, maybe not. We'll find out. And James definitely has an opinion on that. And I'm really happy to introduce him now. James, welcome on the program. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Kai.
Yeah, fantastic. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So if I speak a little fast, it's just because I'm nervous because I'm talking to you. Okay.
Okay, no problem.
No, James, I promise you to start the conversation off with a bang. And I think the question includes a lot that we can unpack over the course of our conversation here. And the question is when do you see the financial system as we know it explode?
It could happen at any time. I mean, there's so much debt in the system. The banks are so over-leveraged. There's so many problems with regard to the economy. There's so much intervention by central banks that have distorted the normal market processes. It can basically happen anytime. Somehow they've managed to keep it going, and maybe it's going to keep going for many more months, maybe many more years. But I think we're getting very, very close, because it all comes down to cash flow at the end of the day. And the rising interest rates, I think, will prove to be the breaking point. Remember, to fight inflation, you have to have positive real interest rates above the inflation rate. Volcker went to interest rates 7% over the inflation rate. And we could afford them back then because there wasn't so much debt in the economy. Now we have negative interest rates by minus 7%. So if you deposit $100 in a bank, even if you collect interest before taxes, you still only get $93 of purchasing power at the end of the year. That's not going to solve inflation.
Yeah, what is going to be the breaking point? Do you have in that speculation, obviously, right? But do you have a theory of what might trigger it? What will be the straw that breaks the camel's back?
Yeah, watch the amount of interest expense that the federal government is paying and how much of the budget deficit goes to the payment of interest. Because the budget deficit is ultimately the key as to whether the Federal Reserve is going to turn that paper, those IOUs, into dollar currency. And that's what ultimately will put us on the road to hyperinflation. Actually, we are on the road to hyperinflation in a sense that if they paid a fair rate of interest, the US government could not afford to do it. Let's assume that a fair rate of interest with a 9% inflation rate is 11 or 12%, 2 or 3% above the inflation rate. Right now, the federal government is only paying, a couple percent. If you add 10% interest rates on a $30 trillion debt, you're talking about, billions and billions of destruction to the federal budget deficit that are going to cause even more deficits or bigger deficits and more Federal Reserve money printing. Or currency printing, I should say. So yeah, watch the interest expense burden of the federal government. That, in my mind, is the key.
Yeah, that could really be the breaking point. But the question is, it seems like the Fed is caught between a rock and a hard place, right? As you said, negative interest rates right now are real interest rates. But also, if they hike it, if they do pull a Paul Volcker and just raise all of a sudden by 10, 15 basis points, just to catch inflation, it'll just completely implode. Because as you said, they can't service the debt. Right?
Yeah, $31 trillion of debt. Every 1% is $300 billion. If they were to raise it to 10%, that's $3 trillion. That's almost what the government takes in as revenue in the course of a year. They're not going to cut down to spending no money on all of the other areas. They'll go to the Federal Reserve to come up with the currency to fund the federal government deficits, and that's what creates hyperinflation.
What I always find interesting is a comparison with Japan, right? If you look at the debt to GDP ratio, and the US sits, I think, around 130%, while Japan is at 260% of that ratio. Do you see the US going to that level as well? Because a lot of the debt in Japan is domestically owned, And it looks like the US will go the same route because China is selling all their treasury bonds and everything they bought over the last few years, and the US is buying it pretty much from them. Like, do you see the US heading the same direction?
If we don't change our way, we will. But keep in mind, you can't make a direct comparison to Japan because it is not the world's reserve currency. It's not the most popular currency used in international payments. The dollar is. So it has a special role. And that demand for the dollar can evaporate very, very quickly if the US government, the Federal Reserve, don't maintain the purchasing power of the dollar. See, Volcker had the same dilemma that Powell does. Powell does now. What Volcker chose to do is to save the dollar and raise interest rates. Powell wants to save the dollar, but he can't raise interest rates without destroying the economy and the federal government budget deficits. So as a consequence, the dollar is going to suffer.
Doesn't look like it right now, to be honest. Like the US dollar is really strong compared to the euro, even to the yen. And one of my guests in the previous show mentioned, well, it's the best of the worst,
That's exactly right.
right? So it's like, again, and then I remember Trump's president days, like he said, well, we need a weaker US dollar so we can actually get the economy going again, right? So like, what's the way forward?
The famous hedge fund manager once said that the dollar is the best looking horse in the glue factory. So when you compare it to the euro and the yen, which have severe problems, many more problems than the US government has, the dollar looks okay. And you're seeing a knee jerk reaction because people are thinking in terms of currency. If the euro is a problem, they got to go somewhere. They're going to go into the dollar, but they're also going to go into gold and silver. And I think we're seeing that in terms of the physical demand for both of those precious metals.
I think that momentum has just changed over the last, let's say, 10 days as well. Like I see a bit of a trend change. Like I'm not a technical analyst, so forgive me for that, but it looks like gold has hit a turning point. Silver definitely has recovered as well. It's above $20 again. Do you agree? Like, because gold didn't look like a safe haven for the longest time.
Yeah. Well, it is a safe haven because once you own it, you own a physical, tangible asset. It has no counterparty risk, and that's what makes it a safe haven. It's not dependent on someone's promise to give that purchasing power to you when you need it. That's what makes gold as money. Same thing for silver. Obviously, the metals have been under pressure recently. I'm very much I've written a lot about how central banks have suppressed the gold price in order to make the dollar and other national currencies look good, but they can only push that so far. And I think we're reaching the stage where the metals have finally turned. This last little takedown that we saw over the past couple of months, I think, has finished. And I think, as is seasonally often occurs, gold and silver too will be strong going into year end and into the first quarter of 2023. 2023 should be quite an interesting year for the precious metals.
Yeah, it should be. And it's like I was actually quite surprised how well gold held up. Everybody was fleeing to cash. Like the overall indices just dropped dramatically. We've seen the tech stocks completely, or I wouldn't say completely implode, but implode. And but gold held its ground. It's like but it didn't run to $2,500 or $3,000 as some analysts predict, right? How
Not
happy?
yet.
Not
Not
yet.
yet.
I was going to say, like, how happy are you with the gold price, and what do you see then in 2023 happening?
Well, I can't say I'm happy or unhappy with the gold price. Gold serves a purpose, just like any other asset. It serves a purpose because of its usefulness as money and preserving purchasing power over long periods of time. An ounce of gold today still buys the same amount of crude oil it did back in the 1950s. That's how it preserves purchasing power. That's the key point of my book. It's natural money. We have to recognize that it is natural money. These issues were intuitively understood up until the 20th century. But as fascism grew in the 20th century, as governments became more authoritarian, as they became less moral, they moved away from these basic principles of money and how money drives society, how natural money drives society. We have to move back in that direction. Otherwise, I think we're going to have some serious issues as we go forward. The problems can be solved. We know what they are. It just takes the will and the political leadership to make that happen.
Let's drill down on that. Like, what are some of the solutions? Like, massive debt. How do you get rid of the massive debt? Inflation is one way, or print yourself out of it, which causes inflation, which is probably the same result, right? It's like, what's the way forward here? Like, that's sort of coming back to my opening question. Like, what will happen once the financial system as we know it collapses?
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about the US dollar in two different ways. There's the true US dollar, and then there's the phony US dollar. We call the phony US dollar a US dollar, but it's really not an obligation of the US government. It's an obligation of the Federal Reserve. If you look at the paper in your pocket and you read the top of that dollar bill or that $10 bill, it says Federal Reserve note. What you have to do is you have to get rid of the Federal Reserve and go back to constitutional money, which is gold and silver coin. Article 1 says that the federal government can coin money, it can't print money, and regulate the value thereof. And what regulate the value thereof means is they can set the gold-silver ratio so that there's always sufficient metal in the country to coin both gold and silver coins. The solution is there. The same thing in the UK. The coin of the realm is the gold British sovereign. All I have to do is go back to sound money, go back to gold and silver as a gold substitute, and return to the basic principles that worked until 1934, when gold was confiscated in the United States by Roosevelt, Russia by Lenin, Hitler by Germany, in Germany by Hitler, and in Italy by Mussolini. We have to get gold back in people's hands. To put gold in people's hands gives people the ability to control government spending, because you can't create gold coin out of thin air, but they can create Federal Reserve notes out of thin air, and that's what gives the government the power.
How much doom and gloom do we put into this? Like, because for me, it's like if I spin this theory in my head, it feels like we can't get to that point where it's like, okay, we're going to transform the currency system without a major news event, meaning war. Like that restructures, rebalances, or resets, the big reset, pretty much resets everything, right?
Yeah.
It's like I can't get past that. Like, what does that look like in your mind, in your opinion?
It is a possibility that we could go that way, and we seem to be moving in that direction, but it doesn't have to be. We know what the problems are, and we can solve it if we have the will and the political leadership. It's happened before in our country twice. After the Continental collapse during the War of Independence, one of the reasons why the framers created a more perfect union was to have Article 1, Sections 8 and 10 in the Constitution determine that gold and silver are the money of the new country. So they went the right way. After the Civil War, with the issuing of greenbacks by the US government, they realized that they had a monetary problem then. They created a 10-year plan to resume going back to gold, and they did, and they implemented it, or back to silver at the time, because we were still on a silver standard, and they set the gold-silver ratio accordingly. So we can deal with that if we had the political will and the leadership, but there isn't that political will or that leadership. And consequently, we're continuing to go down this wrong road. And that's the road that could lead to a lot of social disruption and could lead to war.
I want to go down that rabbit hole a little deeper, because you cited some events that were back like 100 years ago, right? And now we're living in a modern day. It's 2022. Everybody has the internet. I'm sitting in front of 3 screens. I got gigabit internet here. Everybody has access to all the information in the world. Twitter, one thing as well. Bit different back in the day. You probably had one newspaper, if at all. I'm not sure. Gutenberg Printing Press was a little bit earlier. So yeah, I think we had one newspaper or two maybe, but it was easier to control the masses, right? Now it's like in worldwide, like there's too many opinions, like, and you're talking about strong political leadership. I think the U.S. can't even find 2 decent political candidates to put up for presidency right now.
Yeah.
Right. So how is that? What is that? What does that have to look like?
Yeah, things have changed, but human nature doesn't change, nor does a lot of the other things that affect human decisions. Mark Twain said that if you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. If you don't read it, you're uninformed. So, today it's the same type of thing. You can go to the internet and you can be misinformed. If you don't go to the internet, you're uninformed. But you have to form your opinions one way or another. Hopefully, if people are, as they see the problems with inflation and try to get ahead, are spending the time to educate themselves, to learn about money, to learn how its currency is different from money, to learn how central banks are the barbarous relic of the past and not gold, as is propagandized by many, many governments and their officials. This is a key point of the book, Money and Liberty. Money, as gold and silver, are inextricably linked to liberty. It was understood by the framers of the Constitution, and that's why gold and silver coin are part of the Constitution. we've abandoned that. We have to go back to that.
No, I don't disagree with you. I'm just trying to challenge you a bit. I'm definitely on your side of as well. And I feel like we always live in our own echo chamber, right? We always
Yeah.
listen to people. We follow people on Twitter that whose opinions we agree with, but it's always difficult to get another opinion. Like people are opposing the gold standard, for example. Like what speaks against it? Are there any other alternative like solutions out there? It doesn't feel like one, at least not in my echo chamber.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of the gold standard because the gold standard is actually something that's controlled by central banks, and we've seen that central banks have worked to the disadvantage of us individuals to the advantage of giving governments more power, and that is something that is not equitable. It's contrary to the principles of the Age of Enlightenment, which the framers of the Constitution relied upon to create the country that they did, that was different from the rest of the world. So we have to we have to look at what happened in the past and learn from that experience and understand the relationship between money and liberty. I think that's a key element.
Now, I want to stay on this US dollar for a second before I want to talk gold silver ratio. But
Yeah.
before we hit record, like we talked about protecting the status of the US dollar as a world currency, as a world reserve currency. Like, how far will the US go to keep it that way? Because it seems like there's competition popping up.
Well, they're sending troops all over the world to try to maintain that position. Whenever the euro was threatened as an alternative currency for payment of crude, troops went to the Middle East. Gunboat diplomacy has not died. It's just not used as a name anymore. We don't. The U.S. government's going to do whatever it can to maintain this special privilege it has, but the problem is if you abuse it too much, and it is being abused by too much currency being created by the central bank, too many rules and regulations impairing the economy and people's freedom to act and do with their wealth what they want to do with their wealth. Ultimately, you're going to see some social changes occur. And that's why I'm saying that we have to recognize we're going down the wrong road and realize that we want to turn around and go back the right road so that we don't go into a more serious social crisis or perhaps even a war.
Yeah, it's a social crisis is a good segue to is like the pursuit of happiness. I really want to. I'm curious. What do you mean by that, and what does that look like in terms of money and liberty, like in that context?
The pursuit of happiness is whatever people want, as long as they live in accordance with natural law, and the basic principles that humans interact with one another in a peaceful and a harmonious way. My pursuit of happiness is different from other people's pursuit of happiness, but that's the whole key of the Constitution. We want to live our lives like we want to live them. There's a great quote in the book. It was by a British professor. He says, "Capitalism is what happens when you leave people alone." And I think that explains what human nature and society is all about. Let people work with one another, without government interference, without government intervention, without government, taxes taking such a large portion of what people earn. Because when you take tax, you're taking away people's time. When you inflate the currency, you're taking away people's time, the time that they spent to earn that purchasing power. And time is the most precious thing we have on this earth.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. Circling back, jumping around just a little bit now to cover a couple topics, like you mentioned the gold and silver ratio
Yes.
before. Like, where do you see it heading, or where should it be right now? Because I think we're trading at 1 to maybe 87, 88 right now.
Yeah. Well,
That's,
the geologists tell me that there's about 12, maybe 15 times more silver in the Earth's crust than gold. So implication would be that the ratio should be, maybe 15 to 1, or was common 16 to 1, which was the ratio set by the US government in 1837. In 1792, the Coinage Act set the ratio at 16.7 to 1, but because it was out of balance, Congress acted as required under the Constitution and changed the ratio. They regulated the money by changing the ratio to 16 to 1, and that remained until 1900 when the Gold Standard Act was passed, and the federal government went to a gold standard rather than the silver standard that prevailed previously. The ratio is way out of whack. Silver is less than half the price it was in 1980. How many other commodities, are so cheap? The reason why silver is cheap is because central banks manipulate the gold price, and to manipulate silver is easier than manipulating gold. So you can create a lot of propaganda effect by making silver look bad and keeping people out of gold. So the silver is unbelievably cheap. It could get cheaper if central banks continue to manipulate it. It was recently 120 ounces of silver equal to 1 ounce of gold. But my guess is that given the lows that we've seen, which I think are the lows, this past August, which is continuation of the trend from December of 15, which is, I think, the most important low. And given the fact that we've been in this trend since 1913, when the Federal Reserve created, remember, a dollar back then, it was $20.67 equal to 1 ounce of gold. Why is it, $1,750 today? It's because the currency has lost purchasing power. An ounce of gold still buys the same amount of crude oil that did 50 years ago, and probably what it did in 1913, although crude oil wasn't as important back then as it is today.
Interesting. Yeah, the gold versus crude oil is an interesting factor because we've been using both for a while, so it's good to
Yes.
compare those. James, how are you playing the current market environment right now? How are you positioned? And I'm not asking for stocks. Is it more general? Do you play the bigger minor indices? Do you play do you own ETCs, ETFs? How are you positioned right now? And I'm sure you're expecting a bull run in the fall and then in 2023.
Yeah, to answer that question strategically, what I've been focusing on is avoiding financial assets and owning tangible assets of all sorts. And that includes near tangibles. By a near tangible, I mean an equity of a company that's involved in a business that is tangible, like the mining companies, the agribusiness companies, timber companies, land companies, but not things that are involved in finance, mortgages, credit cards, that kind of stuff. So stay away from financial assets, focus on tangible assets, because you don't want to have counterparty risk first. And secondly, you don't want to have exposure to national currencies, because I do believe that the national currencies are going to continue to inflate away and lose purchasing power. So strategically, that's the way I'm playing it, and that's the way I recommend it. The other thing I recommend is that view gold and silver to be a form of savings. As your budget allows, every month, just continue accumulating them. You can't save currency anymore because of the negative interest rates. Gold and silver provide you the means to preserve your purchasing power, and you do that without any counterparty risk. So continue to accumulate gold and silver, however you want to do it. Whether it's through coins or other ways, but make sure it's always physical. And in that sense, there are only a couple of ETFs that deal with physical gold and physical silver. Make sure you're in those.
Yeah, and taking delivery is a bit tricky though on those. So
yeah, delivery is tricky, which is, again, when you're buying gold and silver, you have to figure out, why are you buying it? If you're buying it as a form of savings and you want to be able to have access to it, there are only a couple of alternatives. You deal with a company like mine, GoldMoney, or you buy coins. And I do recommend you consider both. Ultimately, it's the pursuit of happiness. What makes you prepare for an uncertain future so that you sleep well at night? That's what it all comes down to.
yeah. Do you still have the gold-backed credit card, James?
No, not at the moment. The regulatory issues were just too cumbersome, and they just make it so difficult. Banks don't want any competitors. Governments don't want any competitors. They don't want gold competing with US dollars, the Federal Reserve notes. So they make it as difficult as possible. Not only do they manipulate the price to keep gold looking unattractive, but they also put in rules and regulations that make it almost impossible to run a business in that area.
See, and this is where we could jump down the crypto rabbit hole, but we're not going to. So
I'm happy to do that. I've been following crypto since the first white paper came out back in 2008. I remember when that first slice of pizza was bought for, I think it was 7,000 Bitcoins or something like that. At first, I was skeptical, but when it got to $100 a coin, I realized that it was a technological advancement. And I also realized that it's a form of currency. It's not crypto money, it's cryptocurrency. It's a form of currency outside of government control based on prevailing technology. So there is a role to play for crypto. And I've said that, consistently, since it was 100 a coin, which I guess was maybe 2011 or 2013. I can't really remember now. It's been so long.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, no, just like crypto is a whole nother discussion. And if we start mentioning it a little more, all the Autobots will come into YouTube comments. So we're going to stop the conversation here. And I'm not going to put
Okay.
it in the title because that's going to ruin everything.
Okay.
No, James, I really appreciate your time. This is super insightful. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And where can we find more? I have your Twitter page here open as well. It's at FGMR, Free Gold Money Report.
That's right. FGMR.com is my website. You can also find, occasionally I'll have an article posted on goldmoney.com, but most of my work now goes on FGMR.com. I remain a director of GoldMoney, as the founder of the company, and my family remains a large shareholder of it. But I'm no longer actively involved in the day-to-day in GoldMoney.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, James. It was great having you on, and everybody else. Thank you so much for tuning in. It was a great pleasure having this conversation with James Turk. Somebody like I've looked up to. I've followed ever since I got in the industry over 12 years ago. So it's great to have had the chance to speak with James, and make sure to follow him as well. He's got great opinions on what is happening, and follow some of his advice. I find it really valuable, and make sure to follow us, of course, for more content and to subscribe to our channels. Thank you so much, and we'll be back with more soon.